to our, I think it's our third high school workshop. And today is on teaching video game music to non-majors and non-specialists, which has been a pretty high demand topic in some of the feedback that we've gotten. And so I really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today. I'm Dr. Michael Austin. I'm senior lecturer in music and sound at Edge Hill University and program leader in music production there. I'm also the executive director of the Society for the Study of Sound and Music in Video Games. And again, I just want to welcome you all to our workshop today. For those of you who aren't really familiar with our organization, the Society for the Study of Sound and Music in Games is an international organization dedicated to the development of sophisticated understandings of sound and music in games from any and all perspectives, which includes sports, e-sports, tabletop games, any sort of interaction with games and music. And to build a large and diverse body of knowledge, membership in the SSSMG is interprofessional and interdisciplinary and open to anyone involved with music, with sound and music in games. We also have a peer-reviewed academic journal, the Journal of Sound and Music in Games, which is published by the University of California Press, and of which one of our panelists, Stephanie, is a associate editor. And so this high score is our new series of pedagogy workshops designed to explore various topics related to teaching video game music and audio and teaching music with video game music and audio in higher or tertiary education. And so each session will include a panel of experts in our field with expertise in the topic at hand who share insight, helpful tips, research, etc. And so we hope you find it useful today and worthwhile in incorporating into your own teaching and pedagogical practice. So before I get too far in and introduce our panel, I really did want to just do a couple of very few housekeeping things and to remind everyone that today's session is going to be recorded. So if you would make sure that your video is fine, but make sure that your audio is muted. And that in a week or two, this video, like the other two, will be published on the SSSMG website. So you can come back and refer to this later. Our panelists will be, speaking most of the time about projects that they've done and classes they've taught and some of the experience that they have. But we will spend a lot of time on question and answers. And so you can go ahead and type some questions in the chat as we go along, and we'll try to address those, especially if you aren't interested or you're uncomfortable asking your question on the video. And then I will put in just a few minutes a link in the chat. And if you would, either near the end of this workshop or before you leave, if you'll visit that link and give us some feedback about the session today. A lot of it will be about your experience, what you enjoyed, kind of the things that we can work on to make this experience better. But also there's a place for you to recommend other topics for us to cover in future workshops. So please, before you leave, please fill out that survey. And so our panelists, we have Dr. Matthew Thompson, who is active as both a pianist and a vocal coach, as well as a ludomusicologist at the University of Michigan. Over 1,000 students have taken his groundbreaking video game music class, and it's provided the genesis of a 2021 chapter in a book called Teaching the Game, which he co-authored with Karen Cook, Julian Grasso, Dana Plank, and Ryan Thompson. In 2020, he released the world premiere recording of For the Piano by Halo and Destiny composer Marty O'Donnell. He's presented multiple times at the North American Conference of Video Game Music. And also, he's chaired and presented for the first ever academic ludomusicology sound studies track at GameSoundCon, which is historically an industry-based conference. And so I know Matthew's got a lot of experience, especially teaching large format classes with a lot of students in it. So I'm really excited to hear about that. Then our second panelist is Dr. Stephanie Lint, who's a multiple winner of the DAN, which I don't know what that's an acronym for. but at School of Drama and Music Teaching Award, and is an associate professor at Queen's University in Canada, who teaches a variety of courses in music theory, analysis, and musicology. Her research interests include video game music, transformational theory, and contemporary Canadian art music. Her research contributions include articles in Intersections, The Soundtrack, Music Theory Online, Perspectives of New Music, and presentations at numerous conferences, several book chapters, and her book Authenticity in the Music of Video Games, which was published by Lexington Press in 2023. She currently holds a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada Insight Grant focusing on the intersections of musical structure and instrumentation with gameplay narrative. So welcome to our panelists, and I think we're going to start off with Matthew.
Okay, I'm going to leave myself muted when I'm not speaking because next door is musical theater lessons, and we're kind of in this little vocal area. So if you start to hear those sounds, that's what's going on. It's an honor to be here today. I hope some of the things I tell you are helpful for you in your own teaching and work. And I'm going to quickly kind of overview. Hearing Michael read my bio made me realize I need to update it because I've done several new things since then. And I think that they could also be useful for this. So I am not a theorist. I'm not a PhD. I'm a DMA, but my mentors, they taught and wrote and performed, and that was the life I wanted to do too. So I have a collaborative piano DMA, and I'm kind of 50% within the voice and opera department. I work as a vocal coach. I teach opera workshop classes. I teach classes on lyric diction and art song, um, that sort of activity. And then the other side of my portfolio is outreach teaching. And in that I've taught, which I won't talk about today more than mentioning it, an engaging performance class, which is a live performance appreciation class. We go to music, theater, and dance. A large sort of music appreciation through the lens of video game music class. And then this fall, for the first time, I taught a course writing about video game music, which was an upper level writing requirement class. So juniors and seniors mainly populating that class. And I also, and this semester, I'm teaching with the head of our Korean center a K-pop and beyond vocal music, popular vocal music in Korea class. And that's been a blast too. So I have a lot of engagement, in other words, with Central Campus and going outside of just, I love working with the next Pavarotti, but I'm also happy to go down to Central and teach, people who are just doing it because they love it. So, as a sort of mission for myself, I've made it a goal to figure out how I can use video game music as a teaching tool just as absolutely much as possible. And I'm not going to play this video here, but I often show a slide similar to this. And this is Thomas Yee. Some of you will know if you do reading. He wrote a piece, Concerto Ludus, for me for piano, Game Boy, and animation. And I recorded it in the studio this summer, and its release is very cool. But for sake of time, I'm just going to zip on here. How do I go to the next slide? Oh, I have to click this. Okay. Okay. So I teach this large outreach class, which we call PAT, Performance Art Technology 305. And this semester, for the first time, it has a grad version as well, because I've had grad students take it, like a PhD in mathematics and things like that, but they couldn't get credit. And sometimes that affected their scholarship and stipend and things like that. It's exactly the same class for the grads, but they have to also write a research paper project as part of the rest of the class. So in 2012, I got a call from our one of our deans, and she said, "You're great at writing, teaching, non-music people and things outside your specialty." What? And what could you invent that would be of interest for a large population across the campus? And I said something about words and music, and I'd use, the Bernstein unanswered question, which I should have because of my training and background. But then I hung up and I called her back 30 seconds later and I said, "I'm sorry, that was what I should say, but what I want to say is video game music." And she said, "Okay, tell me more." That's it. So I started doing a lot of research, and I started the class for the first time in 2013, and it has had students from every major and every kind of population across campus. So I think of this large class, which I've taught as many as 120. I pulled it back to 100. It typically has a population of between 80 and 100, um, just because I don't want to have more students too much. Um, uh, I think of it in three sort of pillars. I think of it as having history, theory, and that shouldn't say pedagogy. That should say analysis. That was me working really late last night. History, theory, and boy, I didn't write that slide right at all. Anyway, it should say history, theory, and composition. Those are the three pillars that should be on that slide. So we start out and we're looking at early notable examples of games, and I go through a very historic progression up until about the mid 90s when CD audio is common and we have the sort of the standard quality that we have today. I tend to look mostly at popular games because most of the students are going to connect with those, but I'm happy to look at particular game that's more niche or academically, studied. Um, and I also let the students choose. Sometimes whoever has the highest score in the class can choose something we look at. We talk about the programmatic nature of video game music as a narrative builder in the world. Look at games and think about when and where cues might be developed, and why, and think about cutscene versus gameplay and the differences that happen with audio about that, the different functions of game audio, and then, so menu music, game over music, music, something like that. And then even differences in if you have the same function but across genres. So what is the menu music in Final Fantasy 13 where you're there for many minutes upgrading your character versus something like Mega Man where you're just choosing a stage very quickly. I talk more about musical things like form. That's a really easy one for the students to grasp because game audio is so repetitive. That's really in their ears. Leitmotifs, diegesis, what's happening within the world of the game. A radio that you hear like in BioShock versus, Link walks into a building and the music ducks a little bit. Does that mean the music is coming down like from the sun on Link all the time as he walks around? So getting them to really think about some of these choices, both vertical and horizontal layering so that they can start to analyze and notice these. And then adaptive audio in modern games where I literally have recorded myself playing it recently. I show Ghost of Tsushima. I play this one mission and I'm very like sword blazing and we listen to that and then I play the same mission, but I sneak around and stab people in the back. And it's a very different audio track. To really show them how you can have a totally different experience from another person. Um, that covers sort of the history and analysis part. Then we turn into the composition aspect, which is kind of, I spend the second half on. I show GarageBand in class as an example, but I don't mandate that they use any particular software. I have a big list of softwares that students have used and been successful, and I encourage them to use one that matches with their skill set and interest. I've had people want to learn something new and people who it's their first time and they need a very friendly hands-on one. We also have industry visits, and I mentioned that just to say the industry folks are, I think, pretty kind and generous if you're willing to do, reach out and ask them to be involved. So on the first day, I say, look, I just love game audio, and typically in class, there's somebody who doesn't play video games and can't understand how a professor is going to talk about it for a whole semester, the music in particular. And then there's somebody who's already released a game in the Steam store and has, is pursuing that. And I have to kind of find a way to navigate that entire range. And I think I do it okay. And then I have this to show you that I also want to encourage you to think about cross-campus connections. We have a game development class and those students make a game and my students can sign up to get extra credit and join with them and leave the course with their sound and music in a game if they would like to. It's extra work, a lot of involvement, but that people rate that as one of the absolute best parts of the class. And on the last day, I'm happy for people who are thinking, because there are a number of engineers, as you can imagine, that they might go into something related. But to get them to even think, oh, there's some thought that goes into those beeps and boops that my app makes. But more broadly, I'm happy to get STEM students to break out from the formulas and sort of very standard, rigorous, uh, non-creative thinking that they typically have, and also for every student in the class to improve their listening, which I think serves skills no matter what you're working in. Oh, we don't need to hear that. Okay, so quickly to talk about a couple other things I've done, just in case any of this is interest when we get to the QA. Like I said, this fall, I first taught an upper level writing requirement, which was called Bleep Bloop, writing about video game music. And we had different assignments of a blog, writing a concert review, writing program notes. These are all things I've had to do myself as an author, so I thought that was good. Writing a chapter review, and then everything starts to focus on their final project. So it's kind of scaffolded is the word they like to use. They can just write an abstract for whatever, but I encourage them if they know what they want to work on with their final project to do that. But then a thesis outline, annotated bibliography that eventually swings into drafts and a final. And the final, I encourage them to do it multimodal if they like, kind of like an 8-bit music theory thing. They submit me the script with their bibliography and all that kind of stuff. But some people write a traditional paper. I had a student make a podcast. I mean, the paper doesn't serve, as we all know, music super well because you can't hear it. So in that class, which met Monday, Wednesdays, on Mondays, we would have a reading assigned. I had some structured because I wanted them to see some different authors and how they worked. But then I also left open space for, and they wanted to read about, like Pete, I see Pete here. They wanted to read about drunken game audio. That was one that I suggested, and they thought that was really fun. And so they would present on a reading in duos and critically analyze it, and then talk also about the writing style and how that worked. And then on Wednesdays, we focused on our own writing, peer reviewing, and writing exercises, and using things from our writing center about how do you make a convincing thesis, how do you make an annotated bibliography, that stuff, and how do you use a library? My God, I find students really don't know how to use a library these days, which is kind of stunning to me, but I'm old. Um, and then I also, and I'll just super briefly mention this, I also for 1 year taught a piano studio of um, non-majors except for one doctoral in piano, but everybody else was a non-major. And I had I've never played the piano before, but I can read music, so I didn't have to jump that gap all the way to the doctoral pianist. And we studied piano for a year via everything was video game music related. And that was a really interesting project that is going to be a book. I just signed my contract with Intellect, and they have asked me to flip my cool title and my very understandable title. So now it's flipped and called The Video Game Piano Phenomenon, fun title. Press A, B, or A flat, depending on how you read it, to play. And look for that maybe out in about a year. I have to submit it in July. So I also have had applied studio, I guess is what I'm saying. So I've done one-on-one, I've done a small class, and I've done a huge class for many, many years. If you want to see more about my stuff, and I am nailing my timing here, I have a YouTube channel where I have some things like one video I made years back goes through form in the Super Mario Overworld theme. I have something that talks about leitmotifs in Final Fantasy VII. I have something that talks about thematic. I think thematic transformation is not the word, but like Ide Fix or something you want to say where it's changed from major to minor and the meter is changed and things like that in Super Mario World. I assign those videos still. Also, I mentioned years back I wrote a blog. Now I'm writing a book. I don't have time to blog, but 1 year I blogged weekly as I was teaching class, and then people have told me I do consults all the time for people as they're building these kind of classes around their schools, and folks have told me they found that and found it very helpful because I was kind of in the thick of it as I was doing that. And then this chapter that Michael mentioned early on is a great chance we all got together and showed how we had spun a similar class to different populations and made it work for our different institutions, which is probably why you're here in some part today. And it's not easy. Nobody knows your situation but you. So you have to kind of work that all out. But if I had one final piece of advice, I'll say it here and I'll probably reiterate it later. It would be make sure that if you're wanting to make a game class or incorporate game audio into your teaching, even just a lesson plan, make sure you love it. These days, sometimes I have people contact me and they say, "Oh, I think I can get this job if I can, do a video game class, but I've never played a video game." Well, then that's not the one you should make up. You should make up a class about something you know and you love. Yes, it is a student draw and it is popular, but there's no way I could have done it, especially with the amount of resources that existed back in the early 2010s when I was making up the idea, if I had not been gaming myself since the beginning. So, but make it up, make up what you need to make up based on your interest and love, and you'll have a lot of success with it too, I believe. So thank you. I look forward to the Q&A later.
Great, thank you very much. And then I'll turn it over to Steph.
Thanks very much. I'm just gonna get my slides up and running. Thanks, everybody. It's great to see some familiar faces as well as some new people I've never met before. So thanks for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Stephanie Lind. I am Canadian, so you're going to hear some of boots in this conversation probably. My course that I'm going to talk about today is an intro level course that I teach at Queen's University, which is located in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. I've taught here since 2008, and I've been running this course for about 5 years now. But I think it'll be helpful to have some context about our program just to sort of give you an idea of how the course fits within our scope of offerings and how it links to some of the other things that I've been doing here. So our music program is a mid-sized, primarily undergraduate program. We have both a Bachelor of Music and a Bachelor of Arts degree within that. But given our small size, we've actually always invited non-music students to take our courses, basically to help with enrollment numbers in particular, but also to bring some really great diverse perspectives to us. My own area of study, I've started life as a music theorist, although I've kind of been gradually shifting more to the musicology side these days. But most of my teaching actually happens in the core of the program. So for example, I teach our core harmony class for the second year students. I teach upper year music theory electives, and I teach a course on Canadian music as well. My research interests in particular center around adapting traditional music theory frameworks to the study of video game music. So, this is stuff that's a little bit hard to adapt for non-majors sometimes. And I had to get a little bit creative in how I decided to do that. I also realized I didn't put my email anywhere on the slide, so I just did it quickly here. So if you have any questions about what I'm about to talk about, or if you want a copy of my slides, I'm happy to share them with you. You can reach me at stephanielind@queensu.ca. So my course itself, it's numbered as a second year course, but it really is meant as an intro level course, and it's a broad service elective that's open to pretty much anybody at the university. The course size has typically been about 150 to 200 students, depending what room we can actually fit it into. We do have a few music students in that course, but primarily the students actually come from other programs. So I see really, really large enrollments in my course from students in computing in particular, given the obvious connection. But I also get a lot of engineers, a lot of commerce students, and a lot of just broad arts and science students in that course as well. For a lot of them, it's kind of the fun elective that they do to balance out some of their other program requirements. Because I've got such a broad enrollment in the course, I've structured the course so that it doesn't require any previous knowledge of music notation, nor does it require any particular music course as a prereq. It really is meant as an intro to, you've never studied music before, but you love video games. This is a good in for you to basically come in and get some knowledge about that. The reason I mentioned earlier I'm Canadian is that our format for university courses, we run 12-week terms. So that is essentially the structure that we're working with here. The course itself. So in designing this thing, because again, I was looking at, well, how can I do this course without necessarily running it as a music theory course? One of the things that I ended up considering as part of this is, where are they coming from? What do they already know? How can I link that to essentially new content that's both going to bridge the gap to music studies, but also maybe fold in some of the other more interesting things about understanding music and video games. So as part of the course, I don't only focus on music, I focus on a fairly broad range of things. I talk a lot about concepts related to game studies, such as interactivity and immersion. I talk about content related to media studies. We have a pretty large film department actually in our universities. So, I'm trying to link to some content that they'll have gotten in some other courses. So things like talking about acousmatic sound, diegesis, and I also talk a little bit about semiotics in the course. I do throw in some musicology, so we do things like looking at trope and topic theory. Once they have a little bit of background that I can use for some basic vocabulary, and leitmotif is one that they actually often know already coming into the course, even if they haven't done previous music knowledge, like Matthew was talking a little bit in his. And then I do sneak some music theory in there because I'm a music theorist and I can't help it. So mainly, like Matt was saying, it's easiest to do that around things connected to form. Because actually, I've found over the years that their ear is actually pretty good. They're pretty good at like listening and understanding repetition and understanding when something feels like it's coming to a conclusion, for example, to talk about something like a phrase ending or a cadence. So, you know, I'm essentially using their listening and their knowledge to basically bridge that gap to introduce them to some of these new concepts. I thought it might be helpful just to kind of give a broad overview of what my week to week looks like in the class. Obviously, I'm not going to go into like super fine detail, but I'm happy to chat privately about that if anyone has questions. I essentially organized the first 2 weeks of the course more around understanding some of the early game history and technological limitations. And then after that point, starting week 3, I go into conceptual ideas. So things like understanding basic theories of game, like interactivity, flow, the magic circle, and so forth. Understanding some of the frequent topics that get discussed within ludomusicology, like affect, instrumentation, immersion, understanding how it intersects with other media studies, looking at diegesis, kinesonic sound, acousmatic sound, and narrative, for instance. And then out of that, I start to move into those concepts that essentially bridge the more media studies kind of ideas with the more music kind of ideas. So looking at trope and topic, for example, allows us to discuss motive. Looking at nostalgia allows us to talk a little bit about timbre and musical style. And looking at leitmotif allows us to talk about thematic repetition and return in some of these bigger things. I do towards the end of the course shifted a little bit more to the player experience. So looking at that unit that I got called fan communities in week 12, I mean, that's really looking at how players engage with the repertoire, not necessarily in game, but outside of game. So it's meant to sort of bridge that gap to have them relate it both to their own experience, but also understand gaming as a sociological phenomenon. You'll also notice if you've been skimming the concepts introduced there that I secretly introduce music and music theory concepts as we go throughout the term. And partly why I've done this is I found that there's actually been a pretty big discomfort with my non-music students in talking about music. They're weirdly quite scared to do it. And they feel a little bit intimidated by the so-called experts in the room, the music students. So what I found after a few years of teaching the course is that it's been really helpful to introduce just some really basic music vocabulary in the first 4 weeks of the course in particular that we can then use as we go through to talk about what we're hearing in our listening experience. So you'll see, for example, in week 1, I've got basic concepts of timbre, density, pitch, articulation, duration, dynamics, harmony. Week 2, I've got things related to phrasing and form. So things like what's a motive? What does looping mean? How do we connect that to a concept like ostinato, for example? How do I understand phrase? How do I understand cadence? Week 3, I start to introduce some of the more harmonic concepts. So things like consonance and dissonance, things like what instruments are being used. How can we listen for those timbres? And things like, you know, what is a chord? Even if you don't read music, like what is the basic structure of this? How do we know if we're hearing this or not? And it's really made a difference, I found, in the level of detail that they use to talk about the concepts in the course. Are we doing for time? Great. I'm going to move on. The course itself, again, it's in 12 weekly units. I have each week they do a weekly discussion post where basically they relate whatever the concept of the week is to some aspect of their own gaming experience. So, you know, if I'm talking about leitmotif, for example, I'm going to ask them to point out a game that they've played that has a leitmotif and then to talk about what situations it comes back in. I also had them read some articles in ludomusicology. I have to do a little bit of filtering just to make sure that they're broadly accessible, which doesn't mean necessarily simple, but it does mean that they're not necessarily using like very, very specific musical vocabulary that I haven't introduced yet. And I have reading quizzes actually just to ensure that they've done the readings. And then the big components actually of the assessment in the course are what I call scene studies, which is essentially I give them a 5 to 10 minute clip from a video game, and I ask them, using the concepts that they've learned throughout the year, to comment on what they're seeing, what they're hearing, how the gameplay modalities work, and how those three things intersect with one another. So basically, you know, kind of the extensions of the concepts that they've learned throughout the term. Just to give you a sense of some of the readings that I've been able to give them, we use the Salin and Zimmerman right towards the beginning of the year to introduce them to some basic concepts around game studies. But after that point, actually, I dip them in pretty quickly to some of the more advanced articles. So the Van Elfren article on analyzing game musical immersion is one that I tend to use from year to year, just because the ALI model really gives them like a good framework for being able to talk about their listening. Karen Cook's article on medievalism and emotion in video game music is really great when I get to the trope and topic content. It gives a really sort of succinct, straightforward presentation of here are some tropes, here are how they are applied in a number of games. The Ivanescu book, I often use the introduction to talk about retro gaming and nostalgia. And depending which topics I end up in towards the end of the year, I've pulled a few things from the Cambridge Companion books and more recently the Oxford volume. Including the Lumumba Kasongo article on Beyond Nordcore, Hip Hop Race and the Business of Gamer Rap, as well as the Ian Hart article around semiotics and performativity. So I am getting into some more advanced concepts, I would say, in terms of how they're understanding their relationship to gaming and listening. And then the last thing that I wanted to go through, I wanted to talk a little bit about pros and cons. And if I have time later, I also have sort of a mock-up of a concept that I often teach in class. But the pros and cons in terms of teaching the stuff, I found a few challenges in teaching to non-majors. It's been a little bit challenging in managing class discussion between a mix of trained musicians and those who are more beginners to music. And that's, again, where I've introduced more of that musical vocabulary earlier in the term in order to kind of bring them all on the same page. I found that I have to really balance it when to teach music concepts and when to reinforce their use in the class discussions. If I don't reinforce their use, I find that they tend to avoid the new terminology and just work off their old knowledge. So it's really been, from a pedagogical perspective, you know, I have to think about how to reiteratively use a lot of these materials. And that's sort of managing their fear around talking about music, which again, to them, many of them, is a very brand new thing to be doing. Because of my course, because it's a very large enrollment course, the grading needs can be a little bit challenging in terms of figuring out like what kinds of materials I can assign in the course. Part of the reason I don't do composing, for example, is because I can't grade 200 assignments. It's just not possible. So, you know, it does prove a little bit limiting in terms of the materials I can use. And I will say with the weekly discussion posts, I've had a massive problem with ChatGPT that I'm still trying to navigate. But the benefits actually have been really, really positive for the department as a whole. One of the things we've seen is that there's been a much better awareness of who we are as a department and what our offerings are. And it's really been like an in for a lot of students to take other music courses, whether that's, you know, something like a basic rudiments course to be able to learn how to read music, or whether that's something more hands-on, practical that they can do. They sort of get over their fear in my course and then often will branch out to some of our other courses. It's a really popular course. We get really great enrollment numbers on it, which is, you know, good for the health and sustainability of our department. But on the other side, actually, I find it really useful for the music students who take it as well. The cross-disciplinary content encourages a wider perspective within our music students, and them talking to students in other departments about a musical related topic sort of opens their perspective on it a lot of times, so that they're not just focused on sort of I have to analyze this piece in a very traditional kind of way. You know, they think about it more from timbre, for example. They think about it more from a narrative and a functional standpoint. And the great thing that's really come out of it is we've had students actually pair up to work on collaborative projects coming out of this. We've had professors from film department, for example, reach out to do some collaborative work with their classes and our classes. And I don't have it here, but it's also led to the development of another course in our department, which I don't teach, but one of my composer colleagues teaches, on scoring for media. So students, for example, will often take my course first, and then we'll continue on to take that as kind of the second semester of doing things related to video game studies. So I think I'm going to put a pause on it there. I do have a little demo concept I can talk about later, but I think probably it makes more sense to jump to the Q&A now. And if we have time later, I can get back to this.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both very much, and it was really interesting to hear about y'all's uh, classes so far. And I have some questions. It brought a lot of things up for me, but I want to open it up to everyone else to see if anyone's got any burning questions right now. And feel free to either type it in the chat or raise your hand and ask it with your microphone. Okay, Nina asked Matthew, uh, can you talk a little bit more about the creative assignment that you do?
Sure. So, thank you for that question. It is, I require 90 seconds to 2 minutes of audio, two separate functions for it. Um, And I really leave it very broad for the students to do what they want. My favorite thing is that the very first time I taught the class, when there were no examples, I actually still annually show examples from that very first time because they were so creative. And so the people, now I can show what other folks have done. But the very first semester, one girl, could kind of play the violin and kind of pluck this little pizzicato thing and did like these chords where she's going from like major to augmented, and then chewed chicken bones because it was supposed to be a horror track. So 90 seconds to 2 minutes, two contrasting um, moods, whatever that means for their things. And they have to do a write up where they're explaining what they're going for, linking to the research that they did. I listen to these as examples, and this is my background experience with making music. So I kind of get a sense of where they're coming from. And then um, finally, a reflection on the process. I think probably a very similar sort of assignment structure to what many of us use.
And then how do you manage marking all of those? Because if you have 200 or so of those, do you have TAs or do you something you do on your own? Or
So I also have weekly assignment posts, like Stephanie was just saying, and I have a grading staff that takes care of those. And we have Chat GPT issues and whatever now, but for the finals, I actually grade them myself, and I just sit down and I just power through, for 16 hours at the end of the term. And I have a document because I found myself I was actually giving myself tendonitis, but I was writing a lot of the same things, and you grade more fairly if you have some sort of thing like that. So I have like, did they present their background research clearly? And I have a few responses, like copy paste. And then did they explain what software and their background with it? Okay. And then what's my feedback about their music, which is always like, okay, you probably need to think more about form and structure. Although I did have a platinum award winning student take the class one time, and his piece is great. And then just, something encouraging at the end. But yeah, I really do take that time to do it, and it's one of my favorite parts of the class. I usually end it in tears, probably because of the stress of it, but also because of seeing the effort and the creativity and the energy that the students put into something they really get into.
all right, thank you. Chris asks, any cross collaborations with esports teams? In developing a course here, I've been reached out to by our esports coach about trying to brainstorm together, but I'm a bit out of depth on any potential connections here. I don't know if you have any experiences. A lot of the same ways whenever we teach music appreciation, for example, we send all of our students to go sit through a recital or a concert and tell them don't clap until you see everyone else around you clapping. And when you write your concert report, don't write about what the tuxedos they're wearing, but write about the music and those sorts of things. And I sort of wondered if you could see some kind of collaboration of sending all of your students to watch a esports tournament and writing about the music or something like that.
Yeah, I haven't done it directly, but I've kind of had indirect connections with that. The year that I taught this course during the pandemic online, the student esports club actually reached out to me about it because a couple of them were in my class. We had actually a really active Discord server for the class that year. It's kind of trailed off since then because they don't necessarily want to be online for academic things as much. But what they were doing is the esports team were they had their own channel on the Discord. They were recruiting, they were posting about events and so forth. We've also that unit where I talk about fan communities. I sometimes talk specifically about esports, and I talk about the ways that audiences basically engage with players in that kind of situation. And even in the years where I don't explicitly talk about esports, I actually talk about a Just Dance international tournament, and then I talk about sort of how live audiences versus online audiences impact what's happening differently to the players. You know, how Twitch streams basically give feedback to the participants, how it creates community, but in a very different way than in-person communities. So I kind of folded it academically, even if I'm not directly engaging with those clubs. I'm talking about themes, and I do encourage like students involved in those kind of activities on campus. Like, I don't want to completely separate out the academic and the club. I think in this case, it's actually a benefit to have links between the two.
Great. All right. Sophie asks about assigned readings. Um, uh, they say the students have short attention spans. They're smart and thoughtful, engaged, but they teach at a music school, and most are performers, not musicologists. Musicology classes feel like eating vegetables. Anything more than 10 pages of reading or inaccessible writing, I notice a big drop in engagement. They just give up. Last semester, I had a great class, and we were able to build up to 20 pages per class. But this semester, my groups aren't willing so far. But the semester is still young, she says. Do you have any suggestions for shorter readings or listening assignments that can pack a punch and engage their attention? And so I think that's a good point, especially with non-majors, but then also with people that aren't necessarily musicologists or theorists.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think you've gotten some good feedback in the chat about, using some 8-bit music theory or scruffy videos or some things like that, depending on what you want. I also I look at my students really respond to readings from practitioners, and they can be like Winifred Phillips, so it's still a scholarly published, situation. But I don't know, somehow if you're like, listen to Little Big Planet 3, and then now you can read her, they can be more drawn to that. The other thing I would say, a tip I actually got from a colleague, the head of our English department. When I teach engaging performance, she'll just excerpt one section from a chapter, and if you take like 2 or 3 different sections, you can sometimes get the same point across. So you're only assigning maybe 4 or 5 pages of reading, but particularly if something's really dense, if you do a short one, and then even, if I were in my writing about video game music class where we're really focused on writing, I might even really go through that in some detail with the class, so that, it can be dense. And I frankly hate authors who kind of seem to want to put a wall up between them and make it difficult to understand. But that exists. And so I would just say use some multimedia things, consider some industry things, and also consider shorter excerpts.
Yeah, I 100% agree with what Matt's saying here as well. And I've actually employed a number of those strategies in my own class, particularly the excerpts rather than the full articles. I really find having the quizzes connected to the articles they do it more, and they do it more in depth because they know that they have to remember the content for the quizzes that they then have to write on them. I also find that sometimes what I'll do is I'll provide key vocabulary terms with definitions before they get started on the article, or sort of orienting sentences. Okay, the first 3 pages talk about this, the broad overview is this. And then I'll do it for the next couple pages. And I will say the list of readings that I had there are almost all under 20 pages. Like I specifically choose things in usually like the 8 to 12 page range to try to make it a little more manageable for students who I know they're really only at a second year level. They're not necessarily ready for more advanced, in-depth reading in that kind of way.
Thank you very much. Daniel asks, I'm curious if either of you have explored transmedia adaptations in video games. That is, games as adaptations of larger media franchises or adaptations of games in other media for your courses. And if so, how do you approach that issue?
I'll just quickly say yes. And I don't know that I noticed. I'm wondering why your choice of issue as the word. I actually show it very early when we're talking about Pac-Man. I call Pac-Man our first, real hit, and I show how Pac-Man went into music like Pac-Man Fever, and then Pac-Land is an animated cartoon from around 1984, and then the theme music for Pac-Land, the animation became into a video game, so we've got all this kind of stuff going like that. When Netflix released Castlevania or whatever, people want to talk about it, but those shows are really terrible most of the time. So aside from kind of mentioning that they're really terrible and you need to be quite a fan in order to stomach them, um, is there a particular lens you're looking through with it? I would just be interested to know a little bit more, but I bet Stephanie knows more than I.
Yeah, I'd also be curious for Daniel to maybe expand on the question where he's coming from. I can say, yeah, I definitely do. I think it's a little bit weird to kind of leave those things out when we're talking about games that explicitly have those like cross-media franchises. So, for example, when I talk about the Star Wars series, when I talk about some of the Batman games, and when I talk about The Witcher, I absolutely talk about their other media forms, whether that be the books, the TV shows, or the films. And I often will do that in my units on leitmotif in particular, my trope and topic unit, and really anywhere where I'm talking about sort of narrative and intertextuality in particular, because they come into those games with the knowledge of those previous media series, right? So it absolutely impacts how they're going to hear, for example, a musical motif in context. I actually do a fairly extensive class discussion around those when I do those series. So I basically, when I'm talking about something like Lego Batman, one of the things that I start the class discussion with is, what do you know about this? What are some of the stereotypes you have about the characters? Like, what's some of the context that you actually know before even walking into the context of the game?
Can I add just one more point, which is that, and I love your cat, Daniel. It's that one thing that can be an interesting lens to look at is what was first, because a lot of the times, like Chance Thomas has been a guest in my class several times, and the Lord of the Rings properties that existed first versus when he was making the music for Lord of the Rings 2 online, and who uses what and how similar are they, and were they developing it without having any idea of the other but arrived at similar things from like text in a book in that case or something like that. So I wonder if any of that stuff might be an interesting vantage for you to kind of use when you're crafting.
Yeah, I saw your comment too, how you're looking at the James Bond game, media, everything, I guess, is probably the easiest way to describe that. I don't look at Bond, but I do look at Star Wars, and one of the things I look at is that often the Star Wars games use a fragment of the famous musical motifs that they then sort of start an idea with and then move on to something new. And I suspect probably similar things happens in I can't remember the music of Goldeneye well enough to remember if it does that, but probably uses the bum at points to kind of signal that connection to the other media source.
Yeah, it does a little bit. And then also, really interestingly, with the James Bond stuff in GoldenEye, there's the Gadon uh, uh, YouTube videos. I think before YouTube was kind of a thing where people would put the console in or the game a little cockeyed so that it would intentionally glitch, and people would sync it up to a Japanese song. I think that people started making videos of them of their own where they would uh, do a stop motion video of them being glitched characters from GoldenEye. So I know there's a lot there, especially with music and that game in particular. So that's really interesting. I have a question regarding has a lot to do with our first workshop where we talked about pitching courses like this, pitching courses that involve video game music. Um, and I understand that especially with like these interdisciplinary large format courses for non-majors, a lot of times the dean's office is really happy for you to do it because it brings in a lot of enrollment, and a lot of times students pay these fees for taking fine arts classes that then they get to use to tune the pianos with, and other stuff, and it's a good money making thing for the music department. Um, but I do know, especially in larger departments with a big cohort of theorists and musicologists, that there may be some people with a really strong connection to um, liberal arts education that may be a little bit upset that all these students they could be learning about Brahms, Beethoven, and Bach, and instead they're spending all this time on video game music. And I was just wondering if you ran into any issues or had any consternation from colleagues and how you address that to say, this music is just as worthy of study, especially for non-majors, as any other kind, and that they are still getting like a valuable liberal arts education by taking this fine arts class rather than, music appreciation or class piano or something like that.
I'd say in my case, it was a bit less of an issue. We have actually some joint programs with our film and media department already in my department. So it was, there was openness to that already. I will say though that the fact that this is a course designed for non-majors, essentially, like a lot of the people who are very sort of laser focused on what they understand musicology or music theory to be have kind of mentally separated this out. I hate to say that. I mean, it kind of sounds like a bad way of conceptualizing it, but I will say we haven't had a massive amount of pushback. This has partly been paired in our department with larger changes that we've been doing to our music program, where we've been actually opening it up to contemporary performance and sonic arts. So we have sort of a larger cultural shift happening with us. I'll also say I'm the only music theorist here, so I have nobody else to critique what I'm doing.
Um, on that, I would say I have experienced it more personally because there was like this battle over we want more voice time with him, we want more outreach time because, the voice is one on one a lot of it, and that's obviously a money loser, as we all know. So that's why I'm assistant professor still after 14 years because they can't ever decide what my benchmarks are to move up the chart. But that said, frankly, if you run a course on Beethoven, Brahms, Bach, I mean, and Bach is my desert island, so I'm not trying to be offensive, but you run a course on video game music and all those guys, one's going to have overflow and one's going to have not a lot. And if your school is anything like I think most are, then we kind of need butts in seats these days. And I haven't, yeah. I would just say try and see, and people will be receptive, especially at the upper admin level. I mean, if you're as long as you're serving what's needed within your department to try something out. I mean, my God, we encourage our students to fail and learn through failure. Why can't we try things out and have that same process and extend ourselves that same grace?
Right, that's a good point. Um, Nina asked a good question about accessibility of older games, and about how students can have access to some of the games that you would teach. And I think probably a good point to make that it's one thing to watch someone play it on a YouTube video, but it's a whole other thing playing it themselves. And they just talk about found that teaching that they limit their teaching to games that are available on Steam, but that aren't too long or expensive or hard to access. And sort of how do y'all strike that balance?
Um, I would say here that I do have an assignment where the students, I ask them midway through the semester to play a game and share their reaction about it in the weekly blogging. And that allows them to place their own thing on their own system, whether that's free or something else. My favorite comment ever was I did that assignment for the first time when GTA 5 came out, and somebody said, I'm so into this class. I played for 14 hours straight. But that's not, I'm asking them to play very short and very analytically minded. And so I particularly say that. But yeah, frankly, emulators. If you really want, we're blessed with a computer and video game archive that has a lot of stuff here. But I think broadening, I mean, I get the idea that you want everybody to have the same experience, so you can talk about that. That is a tricky one. Then you need to do kind of what you're talking about. But broadening it out is another option and letting people share the various things that
Yeah, and I would say it's probably similar on my end as well, although the copyright situation here in Canada is a little bit different than in the US. The mainly we make a lot of use of online resources for students to be able to play the games or reconstructions of the games in some kind of way. So, emulators. Often actually pair that with YouTube videos of the games just so they can see like how the emulator might differ from the original sound. Because it will differ depending on what technology they're actually playing it on. And I'll sometimes do that with more modern versions of the game and then a YouTube video showing the older versions. So for example, when I talk about flow, I have them play Tetris like via the modern official app, but then we look at a YouTube video of the original sound. So gives a little more context that way.
Great. I think I saw one other question about, do you ever include a module that focuses on game effects over game music? So, for example, analysis of the audio of sim racing games.
I do more than a
Oh,
module. I actually fold it into most of what I do. We talk a lot about soundscape, and we talk a lot about analyzing soundscape. So that scene study assignment that I talked about when I did the walkthrough, I actually have them watch and listen to the scene. They have to identify the sounds that they're hearing, which is not just the music, it's actually the sound effects as well. And I have them talk about, differences in timbre between them, differences in volume between them, and sort of what's coming to the fore. Is it more dialogue heavy, for example? Is it more music heavy? Is it more sound effect heavy? So it becomes part of the regular discussion in our class of what we're hearing in the scene and how that's impacting our player experience.
and I would say I have a whole class devoted to sound effects in particular because I have, again, a lot of people who are wanting to create. And I show some do it yourself or else myself do a do it yourself sound effect with like Audacity and my cell phone and like slapping my thigh and hitting the chair, all this kind of stuff. And then I show Mortal Kombat, them making fatalities from some online thing where they're, really doing it at the utmost high level in a soundproof environment. So, but yeah, text speech or what beep speech, whatever you want to call that stuff, and all of those things, or even tracks where it is kind of ambience instead of music. Those are all things that come up at some level.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Um, I think we're doing a really good job of holding it just to an hour. If people are interested in sticking around, we can definitely um, hear Steph's that case study that you had prepared. If you're still willing to do that, if you're interested. If people have to go, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to post the feedback form again. And so if you only had an hour, you have to take off. Please uh, visit that form and give us a little bit of feedback. But then everyone else, if you're interested, can we just carry on? And Stephanie, you mind sharing your screen again and
Yeah,
showing
sure.
us
I'll
that?
go ahead and set that up while people decide whether to stay or go.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. I'll try to keep this fairly brief, just because I don't want to get into a 20-minute lecture like I normally do with it. What I wanted to talk about was a little bit about how I demonstrate some of the music theory concepts, specifically in that course for non-majors. So again, in a context where students can't necessarily read music. One of the ones I do fairly early on in the class, once we talk about looping as a concept, we use Mega Man as kind of the source for that to understand contextually. I give a little bit of background about the game. I give a little bit of background about, the style of game. And what I typically do in the class is I'll have them play it so that they can see how interactive or not in this case that it is. And then before we sort of recap as a bigger class discussion, I watch it together. So just to give you a sense of what I'm going to be referring to here. Yeah, we'll typically watch about like 2 to 3 minutes of that. And then what we'll do is we'll essentially go back and talk about how we're hearing repetition within that. So I play it a couple times for them. It often takes them 2 or 3 listenings to be able to grab onto it. But each time we essentially isolate like one particular thing that I ask them to listen for. So the first time through, for example, I might ask them to listen for where does the music seem to change? And then I'll do another playthrough where I ask them to like raise their hand or they hear the music change so that they can kind of do that in real time. I also will connect that sometimes to talking about 8-bit sound and 16-bit sound. I often take a look at an article by Nikita Bragowinski that talks about specific parameters of sound from that generation. And that article identifies that there's certain properties of tuning, there's the use of sound synthesis with particular timbres, there's a limited number of voices, for example, there's a limited amount of note variety and musical nuance, and then there's a ton of repetition that's used because of memory constraints. I use that as an excuse to teach them the concept of ostinato, of that short repeating motive. And I have them generate the observations about that as a class. So I'll go into discussion with them. And these are the kinds of things that they might observe. For example, this is literally my slide from this year teaching the course. So, you know, they notice things, for example, like there's a bass treble in percussion. So we're hearing essentially like 3 different musical lines happening. They notice, the ones who have a little bit more of a musical ear notice that some of the upper register notes are out of tune. And then I talk about how those are properties kind of inherent to the early technology. I then asked them to listen more from a form perspective about repetition. So I sort of play through the entire level and I asked them like, how many large sections are there? How many different chunks of large content? I asked them, is there any repetition on a smaller level? So, you know, are you hearing a little 1 to 2 second thing repeat? For example, are you hearing a 3 to 4 second thing repeat? I tend to refer to seconds instead of bars because they don't entirely understand what bars are if they don't understand music on the printed page. And then I asked them also to hum and sing along with the theme once they've heard it a few times because it helps them to actually remember it and internalize it. And actually the kind of observations they come up with are reasonably sophisticated. So almost all of them are typically able to hear, for example, in that example that I was playing, that there's an intro, the A section happens twice, there's a B section, and then there's a transition. I don't have that written here, but they do typically verbally observe that. They're usually able to make some basic observations about what's happening that creates contrast in those sections. So for example, this year they said that the A section is fast, it has more layers than B. They're able to hear that the phrase shape goes up and then back down. They're able to hear that B is higher in pitch and has fewer instrumental layers. They noticed that the percussion was basically the same the entire way through. They noticed that the timbres were the same the entire way through. And then actually, when I'd ask them to talk about those 1 to 2 second ideas, I use this to actually teach them about Kaplan's phrase models. So I introduced the concept of basic idea, that this is the original music idea that you hear. Either it gets repeated or it moves on to something different. So in other words, you either get 2 basic ideas or a contrasting idea. That a process of breaking that down into a smaller piece is called fragmentation. And that when we hit that point where it feels like it's coming to a conclusion, that's what we might understand as a canonical idea. And with that basic construction on that, they're actually able to listen and understand sentence structure. So it's a really quick and easy way to kind of introduce them to this in a way that's like pretty digestible for them. Like it links it right to their listening experience right off the bat. And I've seen them actually then start to use the same terminology in their weekly discussion posts, as well as their class discussions around what I'm hearing and how the music is structured. So it's again, it's a quick and easy way to introduce them to something that's seen as a more sophisticated music theory concept. Obviously, I'm not linking it to some of the harmonic ideas that Kaplan uses, but it's, you know, it's a way to look at motive. I think that's pretty intuitive. And yeah, that's it.
No, thank you very much. And that's it's nice to see, you know, in situ, like how you would teach this particular topic or any of these topics and kind of the granularity and how much in depth you are able to go, especially for non-majors.
Mhm.
And, you know, that's really helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I found the big thing too, like once you get over their fear, they're able to digest this stuff pretty easily. Like it's just a matter of often reiterating usage of the same concepts, of linking it to the sound that they're hearing, and allowing them to like try it out in a safe space before they're assessed on it in some kind of way. Like a lot of the fear is just around worrying that they're going to be wrong about the application of it. So
Awesome. Well, as we wrap up, please join me in thanking our panel for being part of this workshop and for sharing everything with us today. I don't know, either jazz hands or emojis or something, but thank you all very much. Thank you all for attending. Please don't forget to fill out that feedback form. And we look forward to seeing you at our next workshop, which I hope will be in, you know, in the spring or early summer. And so if you have any topics that you'd want us to cover, please do give some feedback in that form. But thanks again and hope everyone has a great day. Thank you all so much.